We're so thrilled to be hosting this event today. Thank you for coming to learn more about the tremendous progress that states have been making in addressing the connections between domestic violence and gun violence. And we're really excited about the bipartisan introduction of legislation by our wonderful champions, Congresswoman Debbie Dingell and Congresswoman Robert Dold. So I am going to turn it over to Sabrina Siddiqui, our moderator from the Guardian US, who's going to lead a wonderful discussion today with our esteemed panelists who are working really hard to make our communities a safer place.
I'm Sabrina Siddiqui. I'm a political reporter at the Guardian, and just want to take a moment to thank you all for joining us for this panel on the intersection of domestic abuse and gun violence. We've got a great panel and a lot to talk through. So I'm actually going to first start off by introducing our panelists. Congressman Robert Dold, he represents Illinois' 10th district and is serving his second term in the House of Representatives. Congresswoman Debbie Dingell, who serves Michigan's 12th district, was elected in 2014. Dara Richardson-Heron is the CEO of YWCA USA, which is the nation's largest and oldest women's organization. Assemblywoman Gabriela Mosquera from New Jersey represents the 4th district over there. Ruth is the executive director of the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And Robyn is the executive director at the Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence. So a great group of panelists here. And the legislation introduced today by our two members of Congress was just mentioned. So I'm going to actually begin with the two of you. Congresswoman, if you want to first kick us off by laying out what it is that the bill does, and start off there.
Thank you. Good morning. I was actually going to let the senior member go first.
Anytime a Dingell says senior member, we go with the Dingell, right? So.
But I really am excited to be here with my colleague, who is just a really great guy. So I can't tell you how good it is to be here and to be with all of you this morning to talk about an issue that is very personal to me, and something that we introduced it last night, and we are calling it the Zero Tolerance for Domestic Abusers. And I think it's very important that we frame it that way. I want to thank all of the panelists. I won't rename them each time, but they're an incredible group of people, and we really look forward to the discussions with you today. As you all know, there's lots of fighting in Washington, D.C. over too many subjects, and I really do believe that the American people want to see us come together instead of partisan bickering to find solutions. And I think that there is unanimous agreement that no woman or no child should ever live in fear of their life or their safety because of domestic violence. And that's why Bob is working with me on a bill. The number, by the way, is H.R. 3130. Is that correct, Hannah? I think. So that's what this bill is, the number is. Every 9 seconds in the U.S., a woman is assaulted or beaten, and domestic violence is the single leading cause of injury to women, more than car accidents, muggings, or rapes combined. In my state of Michigan, from the years 2003 to 2012, 341 people died from domestic violence homicides. And of those, more than half of them were with a gun. Across the country from 2001 to 2012, 6,410 women were murdered by an intimate partner with a gun. The numbers are staggering, and the link between domestic violence and gun murders is undeniable. If a gun's involved in a domestic abuse situation, a woman is 5 more times likely to die. I know this, and every time, this is a subject that is still difficult for me to talk about. I think I found my voice a couple of years ago after Newtown, and then why now? Why are we doing this now? For me, it was when the state legislature in Michigan, as legislators sometimes do in the middle of the night, passed many bills and didn't understand that a bill that they had passed would have allowed convicted domestic abusers to carry concealed weapons. And I grew up in a home where I had a father that I'm sure loved me, but could snap like that. And you would go from a normal situation to a nightmare in a second. And when there was a gun near, you didn't know what was going to happen. And it happened more than once. And I lived in a house that shouldn't have had a gun. And I know what it's like to be terrorized, to wonder if you're going to live, to hide in a closet, to have door handles taken off doors, to not be able to escape, and not have the police respond when you're scared to death. Thankfully, the world has changed, and we don't hide from domestic abuse the way that we did 30 years ago. But it's still very real. And people wonder, I called my sister when I first talked about it, and I called her again as I've done this more, and said, do I do this? My mother's still alive. She's in Europe right now, so she's not going to see the press that comes out of this. It's not just my story. And my sister always says, it's my story too. And if we can help anybody else not live through the terror that we did. I have a younger sister that's no longer alive, and I don't think she ever recovered from probably one of the worst nights where I was convinced we were all going to die, because she started first grade the next day. And we couldn't get out of the house. My father had taken the door handles off the door, and my mother had run away. She never was really okay again. She was always scared. She was always afraid for her life and had anxiety the rest of her life. No one should have to live that way. And after this happened in January, I recognized the need for national legislation. And Bob stepped up and realized that, it's just something that we should have as a national standard. So that's why we're introducing the Zero Tolerance for Abusers Act. The first update to the current law would ensure people who have abused dating partners are prohibited from buying or owning guns. Current law prohibits all domestic abusers, people who abused a spouse, someone that they lived with, or someone that they have a child with, from getting guns. But our gun laws don't say anything about people who've abused their current or former dating partner, even though roughly half of domestic violence murderers are committed by dating partners. Abuse of a dating partner is as unacceptable as domestic abuse, plain and simple. And many of them have children in this situation. And the second update is to close the loophole that lets some convicted stalkers legally buy a gun. Stalking is sadly a very accurate predictor of future violence. One study of women who had been murdered found that 76% of them have been stalked. 76% of them had been stalked in the year before their death, the previous year before their death. But right now, people who've been convicted of a misdemeanor for stalking, even if they pleaded down a felony charge, can legally get access to a gun. So our bill makes it clear that nobody who's been convicted of stalking, who could hurt, how many people do you know that could have hurt somebody? I have helped so many people that have no recourse. They don't know how to keep themselves safe because somebody has decided they're obsessed about them and is going to kill them or hurt them if they can't have them. That is not okay, and that's what our bill would do. These are common sense law changes to the law that we believe will save lives. So I'm really honored that my colleague Bob is joining me in doing this. And I think we need to frame this and call it taking care of domestic violence. This is about making sure that every woman and child in this country, and men, by the way, there are men that do get domestically abused, but it's mostly women. So that's what our bill is about today, and I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague.
Well, first of all, Debbie, thank you. Thank you for sharing the story. I don't know what more powerful way we can use as an example. This is a common sense piece of legislation that I'm proud to support as a father of two, as a brother of three sisters, as a son. There is no place for domestic violence in our country and frankly anywhere around the world. And if there's something that we can do to try to put an end to it, then I'm all in. There's a lot of friction in Washington, but one of the things that should not have any friction is the fact that we're here to protect families, we're here to protect women, we're here to reduce handgun violence. You've heard the statistics. A woman is 5 times more likely to be killed in a domestic situation if a handgun is involved. And for me, that's just unacceptable. This is not about lawful gun ownership. This is about trying to make sure we do a bipartisan, common sense solution to make sure that we get guns out of the hands of people that are stalking, whether it be their domestic partner or someone that they've been seriously dating. We know the statistics, and the statistics aren't good. In my state of Illinois, we've had 171 deaths over the course of the last period of time since 2003, and heavens knows how many that have been terrorized. This is one of those things where I can't put it any more succinctly and aptly than what Congresswoman Dingell did in her own personal experience. And we shouldn't have any children or any women or any partner go through this if we can at all avoid it. So this oftentimes what we're talking about is trying to bring federal law in line with many of the state laws that are out there. State laws have passed many of these from Wisconsin to South Carolina to Oregon. And I think that is one of those things that this is something that we should be united behind. United behind the idea that we want to make sure that women and children are safe in their homes, safe to go to school, safe to pursue a career, safe to do whatever their dreams may allow them to do without fear. And so I'm honored to be up here with Debbie, and certainly am looking forward to moving forward on this piece of legislation, which I think is very much a common sense piece of legislation.
Thank you to both of you, and while we have our members here, I just wanted to ask another question to both of you, and then of course I'll open up to the rest of the panel. I think you have limited time this morning. You both pointed to success at the state level when it comes to addressing the nexus of domestic abuse and gun violence. As we saw after Newtown, however, at the federal level, it is very difficult to move legislation related to gun violence. And how do you plan to message this to your colleagues to ensure that it does not fall on a victim to the politics that have been associated with anti-gun violence measures in Congress?
Well, I think one of the things that I think we have to do is we have to be talking about, this is not about trying to limit lawful gun ownership. That's not what this is trying to do. What this is trying to do is, you've been convicted of stalking. You are someone that we've identified should not be in possession of a firearm. That's what we're talking about. So it's already, right now, we have it in federal law for your spouse, but we don't have it right now, as Congresswoman Dingell pointed out, as Debbie pointed out earlier, the idea that you've got dating partners. And so the statistics are out there that are very clear, and we want to make sure that we're doing all we can to protect children and families. And so it's talking about a very, very narrow sliver. It's not talking about a wide swath, and I think that that's going to be one of the, hopefully, the reasons why we're going to be successful in this piece of legislation.
Congressman, did you want to add to that?
I do. This really is a domestic abuse bill, and that's how we need to talk about it. I think, this is a very complicated subject for me, and I know it is for my colleague as well. I'm married to a former NRA board member. This isn't a gun bill. I am someone, quite frankly, that has lived in a home where a man should not have had access to guns, and I spend all of my time trying to figure out how you keep guns out of the hands of those that have mental illness without stigmatizing mental illness either. I mean, these are very complicated situations, and I'm also somebody who really wants to champion mental health issues. But I've lived with a man, and my stepson, shoots every weekend, and these are responsible gun owners who have the very, it's a basic, what does it mean on the right to bear arms? And neither of us wants to take guns out of, this isn't a gun bill. This is a domestic violence bill. We have a way to define a threat to women and children that if someone has been stalked or someone has been convicted, they shouldn't have a gun in their hand because they know that if that person has access to it, the chances of their using it to hurt someone is high. That's what we're addressing. This is about domestic violence. And I'm really, I've gone through, I grew up in the Leave It to Beaver, June Cleaver, where what happened behind your doors you didn't talk about. You really think about the changes we have seen, that, the police didn't come. I called the police. Nobody came. It couldn't be happening at that household. And the man was always right. And look at the changes. Finally, people are willing to admit that these things do happen and that we don't have to tolerate it and that we have to protect women and children from violence. And this is just another piece, as we are willing to acknowledge that there are some bad things that happen, of how we keep people safe.
Thank you. I do want to open up to our other panelists as well, and feel free to chime in if you have anything else to add. But Dara, I wanted to begin with you. You know, your organization deals firsthand with women and families who are affected by domestic violence. Can you kind of talk about the impact of access to firearms on the families that you deal with, and why your organization has decided to take a leadership role here?
Well, thank you so much, and thank you to the Congress and the legislators for taking on this very important issue. You know, at the YWCA, we have been focused on the health and safety of women for more than 150 years, and certainly domestic violence is something that impacts many of the women we serve. In fact, we did a survey of our 226 local associations across the nation, and 75% of them indicate that the women that they serve, women and families they serve, are impacted by domestic violence. When you think about the fact that we serve more than 2 million women annually, that's a lot of women. And it's not just the women, it's the children as well. One of our YWCAs has a school for children who have actually witnessed domestic violence. And as Representative Dingell mentioned, you know, when you see this violence, it impacts you throughout your life. Many of these children have cognitive impairments. Some of them have, you know, academic impairments, and it follows them throughout their life. And certainly the women that we serve, it's very hard for them to get over. And certainly when there's a gun involved, when you think about the numbers, and you know, we can quibble about what the real data shows, but you know, you can see, and some of the data shows that 46 women per month are killed by a domestic abuser. That's over 500 women a year. And we know that's probably an underreport because it depends on how you define intimate partner. That's a lot of women. We see these women day in and day out trying to make their lives better. And when you think about it, your options for leaving are very, very limited, particularly when you have not only the physical abuse, but financial abuse. And then certainly if you were injured, and if there's a gun involved, many of these women are traumatized for the rest of their lives, and it's very hard, even if they do get away. So I don't want to be destitute here and talk about, you know, all the bad things that happen, because we do a lot of great things at the YWCA. We help repair these women's lives. We help them get back on their feet. But we really need to stop this before it ever starts. That's what we need to do, and that's why we're very, very keen on gender socialization. But the most important thing we're talking about today is preventing lives from being lost unnecessarily from gun violence. And that's what I think this bill will do. I think the broadening of the definition around what an intimate partner is very, very important. I think keeping guns out of the hands of people who have been demonstrated to be violent, it almost feels like a no-brainer. But it must be done, and I support this bipartisan legislation to help move this forward, because you know, we would want nothing more than to put ourselves out of business and to no longer have to find a safe place for the women that come to our facilities with the children in tow and nothing but the clothes on their backs. It's a devastating sight. We're happy to be able to provide support, but we'd be much happier to not have to be involved at all.
Thank you. Assemblywoman, I wanted to turn over to you because I see New Jersey as sort of a case study for success. The legislature just passed a bill that would address this very issue in June, and you took a leadership role in shepherding that legislation through the Assembly. Can you talk about how you were able to persuade your colleagues to join this effort, as well as why you decided to take on a leadership role?
Sure. First of all, I have to say thank you so much for having this panel. But I also want to give thanks to Representative Dold and Dingell. Thank you so much for doing this and for introducing this piece of legislation. This is something that is very needed in the country. I was about to say state, but in this country. I'm used to saying state all the time. Thank you so much, because this is very important. In the state of New Jersey, I was able to successfully pass something similar dealing with issues of domestic violence and firearms. And I am grateful for my colleagues that they were able to find the support to do this. In the state of New Jersey, we already do have strong domestic violence bills and strong gun laws. However, I always feel that there's always more that can be done. Particularly in the state, and what my bill does is once a person is already convicted of a domestic violence offense or they have a final restraining order, what my bill does is something very small but very impactful, is that the courts are requiring the immediate surrender of these firearms. So even though they're not allowed to purchase any future firearms and their gun permits are revocated, they're taken away, any firearms that they have in the home or in possession of, they have to surrender to the court if they're convicted of domestic violence or they have a final restraining order against them. Something very powerful for the victims of domestic violence in the state of New Jersey, and it's something that needs to get done, and I am hoping that the governor will sign this bill into law in the state. Why this is such an important issue to me, I am very passionate about domestic violence, and it's because as the Congresswoman, I also am, I wouldn't say I personally am the survivor, even though I was a child. I'm going to quote myself as a child survivor of domestic violence. My mother is a survivor of domestic violence, and she is actually here with me today. And it's something that I carry in the forefront of my mind every day, that I'm passionate about this issue, because every victim of domestic violence who I see is my mom. And even though I was unable to help her at the time, given this opportunity, an amazing opportunity that the voters of the 4th Legislative District have given me to be their representative and to bring this issue to the forefront of the state, and also given actually being here, given the opportunity to be in the forefront in the eyes of the nation, to make sure that this is something that we need to let people know about, that we need to let people know that there is violence against women and that violence has to stop, and it has to stop now. And anything that I can do to lend my support to both of you, please let me know, because this is very important. This is dear and near to my heart, and this is important not only to the women of the state of New Jersey, but to women across the state. So thank you. I'm sorry, across the nation again.
And I do recognize that I believe both of you had at some point had to leave us early. So if you wanted to add anything beyond what you had said earlier, by all means, as a closing remark, let me know. And Ruth, you are not only an advocate in the domestic violence sphere, but also a survivor yourself. I think it'd be very helpful if you could share your personal story and how that intersects with the work you do, why it is critical for Congress also to take this issue up at the federal level.
Thank you very much. And I'd also like to take a moment and thank Representatives Dold and Dingell. This is very, very critical to the women of this nation, to the children of this nation, and everyone impacted by domestic violence. I am a survivor of domestic violence. Guns were used against me during that tenure of my marriage. They were also used against me as I left the marriage to continue to harass and intimidate me. The most interesting thing for me in particular in regards to this bill is broadening the definition to include stalking. I left my then husband at one point at the end of our marriage and literally fled my home. Up to that point, guns had been used to intimidate me. And I think it's really important to understand that violence against women is not the murders, just the murders, or the lethality point of which we see women being killed by guns, but guns are used in these relationships to intimidate and used as a tactic against women in these, when there's domestic violence in the relationship. For years, a gun was used as a reminder that I needed to behave in this relationship. So I think it's very important to understand that when we're talking about domestic violence and we're talking about the intersection with guns, it's not just about the murder-suicides that we read on the weekend. It's not just about those lethality points. It's really about abusers who have access to guns. When I left, my then husband stalked me for 8 months. Over the course of that 8 months, he had 3 guns because the police had stopped him, pulled the first gun away from him, and he was able then to get other guns. So I say that to you so you understand how weapons are used to commit this violence and further commit domestic violence against victims and survivors. As you know, I'm here today. So in the course of my healing journey, by the way, my then husband also used that same gun that he finally used to shoot me to kill himself. And I must tell you that is also a sad note to domestic violence and guns, is we hear very frequently about murder-suicides. But to the second part of the question, which is why do I do what I do today, and why is the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence taking a leadership role in this, is for those very reasons. Too often, it's too easy to have women who are being victimized and reframe it in other issues so that we don't have to address a very human issue, which is someone has been convicted and has been told that they're an abuser, and we still allow them to have a gun. It's a human issue. Why would we have that happen? So with all of that said, I won't take a whole lot more time, but the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence is about zero tolerance for violence against women and about holding abusers accountable. This is a bill that will hold abusers accountable because it really does have an impact, as Dara and everyone else has noted, not just on victims and survivors, but families, communities. Our nation is hurting, and you hear these statistics about women who are dying every day because of guns. I just don't understand why we don't see it as a national crisis. Thank you.
Thank you. Robyn, we've heard a lot from the panel about the very real impact that between the intersection of domestic abuse and gun violence, and one of the points that our members raised that I'm very interested in is the changing trends that we've seen in terms of relationships. There are a lot of women, for example, who get married later, so the current law, because it's limited to a former spouse or current spouse, doesn't reflect intimate partners for women who are dating. Can you kind of walk us through some of those trends that you've seen and why the current law does not adequately address how to focus on how things have changed over time?
Sure. So just to put it in a little bit of context, at this time we have a federal law which prohibits people who are convicted of certain misdemeanors from having guns. We already prohibit felonies, so to the extent it rises to the level of a felony, that's covered. But we've come to realize that when it comes to domestic violence, there are other types of convictions, misdemeanor convictions, which are so indicative of a high level of risk of guns being used that we need to expand beyond the existing felony prohibition. That's what the existing law does, but it's very narrow. It addresses only intimate partners, as has been mentioned, which are spouses or other parents of the same child. It doesn't cover stalking, and it doesn't cover restraining orders before they're permanent. So it contains all of these loopholes and gaps that, as we have more data, as relationships have changed, as we understand better the scope of some of these problems, we've come to see that we can do better in keeping guns out of the hands of people who are really likely to use them, whether it's to threaten and intimidate or to actually harm someone. After 2013, after the horrible tragedy at Sandy Hook, a lot of states stepped up to try and fill those gaps. There was a real trend and a real interest at the state level, because nothing yet had been introduced at the federal level, to try and expand upon the types of prohibitions on domestic violence abusers getting guns to encompass a more intelligent, common sense range of situations and people. We've heard a lot about the relationship piece, so including dating partners is a huge issue. I mean, I don't know that we need the statistics to know that a lot has changed in the last 30 or 40 years in terms of how relationships function, how the scope of situations in which women might be at risk beyond just a spouse. So this is a tremendous step forward, even though states have been, over the last 3 years, we've had 18 states pass significant laws that expand these prohibitions to encompass a broader range of people, and that's fantastic. It's been a really exciting trend for us to witness and to be able to help support, because we see there's political will and motivation, and there's impact. For example, in states where TROs are included, so temporary orders before they're permanent, there's a 20% reduction almost that's been seen. So these laws really are empowering to women. They give them a sense of a path that can be taken, as well as having real impact. We've talked a bit about stalking. You know, part of the issue with stalking is that a lot of times when there's a domestic violence charge, it gets pled down. So you might have a charge against you, and you might offer, instead of fighting that charge, to take a plea deal on a misdemeanor stalking charge instead. Then you're not prohibited from acquiring a gun. This would fill that gap. And even though many, many states have stepped up to fill that gap, it's a patchwork. And so having a federal law that covers all women, no matter where you live in the country, not just if you're lucky enough to live in a state where there's political will to pass these laws, is a tremendous opportunity. I won't get into it now, but one of the other interesting pieces of the puzzle that is not part of this legislation, but we are seeing trends at the state level, is relinquishment, which is how do you then get guns away from abusers once they're convicted of these crimes, or once a restraining order is in place. And that's sort of another interesting piece of the puzzle, because I think it has, as has been mentioned, a lot of impact on the efficacy of being able to protect women in these situations.
And to our members, you know, we talked earlier about the importance of how you message this bill. Can you kind of lay out for our audience here what the next steps are as you move forward with this? And you know, there's no shortage of issues on your plate on any given day. So how do you kind of keep this particular issue? How do you raise its profile and keep it as part of the conversation on Capitol Hill?
Well, there's a couple things. First of all, the bill, obviously, after being dropped last night, gets referred to committee. And one of the things that we need your help with is we need all of you to be active and to be reaching out to your legislators to remind them how important this is. And so this is really going to be a grassroots effort. You know, become a citizen co-sponsor of this legislation and make sure that you're reaching out to let them know that this is one of those things that really we should all be united behind. This is a domestic abuse bill. Zero tolerance for domestic abusers. It happens all over the country in every single congressional district. And so really the next step from just a nuts and bolts perspective is it would go to committee for a committee hearing so that people would have an ability to testify on it, just like we've heard from many of the panelists here, and then be able to bring it to the floor for a vote. But it does need to make sure that it rises, you know, where it's on people's radar screen. And there's a lot of things that are going on right now throughout the country that are some big issues. This is a very big issue too. So again, you know, I think it's very, very important for families, for women, and so that's where we're going to empower each and every one of you to help in this regard. This isn't a one-day deal. This is kind of a campaign to make sure that we're making these common sense changes. It's happened at the state level. As you've heard from people, we need to make this change at the federal level.
I think Bob said it very well. What we would ask of all of you is that we need at a very grassroots level to tell people this is the next step we need to protect women and children in domestic violence. So if we can engage, I know the head of the women's clubs and organizations is here. All of us have different domestic violence groups that help people. There are many people that are willing to talk about this now. We need them to engage in their districts during the August recess, have them talk to their members of Congress, both sides of the aisle, and say, this is what we need to do to continue to protect women and children, and really help them understand why this is so important. You are the people that you need to help us really educate everyone about this bill and how important it is, and talk to people, your elected representatives at a very grassroots level.
Thank you. To the rest of our panel, on that point and the importance of building a campaign, Assemblywoman, I'd love to ask you, you know, how you kind of ran this campaign at the state level, and did you meet with resistance from other outside groups? I'd love for the rest of the panelists to reflect too on how you kind of overcome resistance from some of the groups that like to frame this as a gun control issue, when, as everyone has pointed out, this is about domestic violence.
Sure. Since this is something very important to me, I wanted to make sure that this was something that was very successful on the state level. So what I did was I met with a lot of the individuals that were going to deal with this issue on the ground level, specifically with the courts, because my bill had a lot to do with having the courts require the immediate surrender of these firearms. So I met with the administrative office of the courts, and we worked through any issues that the courts might have, that judges might believe that might have some type of resistance or concerns about the process. I also had an opportunity to actually participate or see how domestic violence runs through the court system when a woman goes in and files a complaint, and how the temporary restraining order is filed, how that process is, and how a final restraining order is granted, and just trying to understand what the process is in order to make sure that the pieces of legislation that I was introducing make sense and will not have any unforeseen consequences. So I spoke with a lot of advocates about this bill. Specifically, one of the major advocates was Americans for Responsible Solutions. They were very helpful in helping with this piece of legislation in the state of New Jersey. And also we had Representative Giffords come in, which was amazing, to the state, and she met with the governor. She met with leadership in the state, which also was very helpful. And getting the support of leadership is huge in the state of New Jersey. And having their support and their backing, making sure that this is something that is addressed, finally gets addressed in the state of New Jersey, was very important to me. So I'm very grateful for Representative Giffords for coming to the state of New Jersey. I'm also very grateful for the leadership in the state of New Jersey for supporting my legislation and for backing it up and for allowing it to move through the process.
Dara, did you want to chime in on that?
Sure. At the YWCA, we also are not focusing on this as a bill about guns. This is about women and families and children and the lives that will be saved when you take guns out of the hands of people who have a track record of being violent. I mean, it just almost should be a no-brainer. Mm-hmm. Again, you have people who are convicted, violent, and even if they're not convicted, they have a track record and history of being violent. And to put a gun in the hands or allow someone to purchase or continue to purchase and stockpile guns, it doesn't make sense. So we really don't focus on taking away anyone's lawful right to have a gun, but we feel strongly that people who are not law-abiding citizens, and you can't be a law-abiding citizen if you're abusing a woman, if you're stalking someone, or if you're taking violent actions to control someone. So that's our focus. We really will be excited to push this out to our base, our local associations across the network from a grassroots perspective, to make sure that they reach out to their Congress, to the legislators, to push this forward, because we fully support everything about it.
Robyn?
I would just add that when it comes to gun policy, generally we work on laws all across the country in almost every state. We can predict pretty significant opposition from the gun lobby and others. We're very accustomed to being challenged mightily across the board. And in a lot of these states where these bills have been introduced, that hasn't been the case. And it's been a very positive experience. I think it has empowered a lot of states where laws that deal with guns on any level can't even be considered to be introduced. Louisiana passed a law, Wisconsin, Wyoming. I mean, there's a number of states where you wouldn't expect to see progress when it comes to thoughtful, intelligent regulation that can prevent these problems from being passed. And in this instance, when it comes to domestic violence, we're not getting the level of pushback that we're accustomed to. And that has been a really positive development. I hope that will be the case as well in Washington with this legislation, and I would like to believe that this issue transcends some of those other political concerns, and that as a result we have a tremendous opportunity to make progress there.
Thanks. And I want to actually take the opportunity to also open up the floor for questions.
I'll start with that one, I guess. I mean, let me just say that we did reach out to the NRA. We gave them a copy of the legislation. And again, because our focus is not about guns, it's about domestic abuse, and it's about making sure we're keeping families safe.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the things that I believe transcends political party. This is not about, Republicans or Democrats or conservatives and liberals. This is about protecting families. And if you look around the United States Congress, there's a lot of families, right? So we're talking about trying to protect children, protect women. And this is, I think, a common sense piece of legislation. We already have federal legislation. On the one hand, we want to expand it, obviously, to domestic intimate partners and close some of those loopholes, which again, I think is a common sense piece of legislation. So.
Have you gotten any response from them?
Well, I mean, I think their initial response is always going to be, we need to look at this and generally no. But I do think that it's one of those that we're happy to reach out, we're happy to work with them, because I do believe this isn't about, as was pointed out, this isn't about guns. And one of the things that I, again, go back to, what should unite us? We're all against handgun violence. What we want to be focused on this bill, more specifically, is this is about domestic abuse and zero tolerance for domestic abusers. So if you want to stand up for domestic abusers, that's your prerogative. I just don't think that that's really what people are looking to do. We want to try to protect women. We want to try to protect our families and our children as well. And that's really what the focus of this legislation, and again, proud to be able to sit up here with Congresswoman Dingell. Debbie's been a great leader on this issue, and frankly, again, I want to thank her for sharing her story, because I think it illuminates this issue extremely well.
And I'm certainly not an attorney, but it's my understanding that in Washington State, NRA was involved in pushing that forward. Maybe Robyn knows a little bit about it.
it's pushing it forward.
Well, that might be too strong. And I'm certainly not here to support the NRA, but I just believe in giving credit where credit's partially due.
I would say that in the many states where these laws have been passed, it's not so much that there's been a proactive push, but there's certainly not been
less pushback.
There hasn't been the pushback. And I do think that these laws, when framed clearly in the context of domestic violence and data and research that we clearly understand, it's kind of, I'm not sure what the position against it would be. You'd have to be defending the rights of somebody who has committed domestic violence abuse to have guns. And in my mind, that's a really tough position to take. So it's not where they've been standing on it.
Ruth, I believe you had a point to add on this subject before I opened up for questions.
So I kind of go back to how we can support and how we meet resistance, how we can support moving this forward, and then how to meet the resistance. But I think the thing that we can think about in regards to domestic violence, because that's what this is about, is that this really is a human rights issue. And how can you be against a human rights issue? The second piece is really the impact on communities, and particularly when we're talking about our local and state policymakers, reminding them that the cost of allowing abusers to have guns and cause harm to women and children is huge. And in some ways, we can't even measure it. I always think about that whenever somebody says, well, this is, you're going to take guns away again, and don't people have a right, and particularly if you can't prove that they've stalked or anything like that, to remind our policymakers that this really is larger than just domestic violence, though it is domestic violence, hear me very clearly, but the impact on our communities is very, very big and immeasurable in some ways. So.
I just wanted to add one quick thing, which is that obviously with any of these regulations, there's due caution for process. None of what's been introduced at the state level, none of what we're talking about that's been introduced at the federal level goes beyond or obviates the problem that we have where you need due process, even in the instance where we've supported legislation that would take guns out of the hands of those with a temporary restraining order against them. That is only pending the opportunity for a full and fair hearing. So none of this in any way abrogates rights that people have to acquire lawfully firearms if that is their wish and they are able to meet the standards set by law. And I think that's an important point, because sometimes the rhetoric which seems to imply that people are going to be denied their lawful rights simply doesn't hold water when you look a little more deeply at how these processes work.
this being a largely grassroots effort. And I had asked the members of Congress, but wanted to have you reflect as well on how to really keep this at the forefront of national conversation, because oftentimes, people are busy and they don't necessarily take out the time. What do you think is the most important way to, one, achieve that, and to, two, message this particular issue?
I'll just briefly say that a lot of these laws that have been introduced and subsequently passed have come in response to specific incidents in particular states. So what we've seen that often happens is there's a tragedy in a given state that really puts a face on this problem. And when that happens, the political will often shifts. And so, for me, because we are so involved on the policy side, it's so important to keep in mind that this isn't just about laws and policies. This is about specific people, and this is about their personal experiences. And I think keeping out front that message, that putting sort of a human face on the impact of an action, I think is a tremendous leap forward. I also think, as with any sort of forward-moving legislation, where we have research, where we have data, where there is information that helps to show how these laws are effective and the impact that they make, I think that needs to also be out front, not just the level of violence with guns and domestic violence, but also when these laws are passed, where we have that information, how it has an impact. I think that's really, really persuasive and helpful.
Just a couple of other points to make. I think sometimes we forget the power of the people, and that we have a right to walk into our policymakers' offices and say, this is what we'd like from you. We want to protect women, we want to protect children. And really talking to them about how important it is that this legislation get passed and that we're going to be saving lives. I think the other thing is that we also have the power of people in just simple conversation, which is through social media, through Facebook, through whatever it might be, in ways that you can reach your friends and allies. The other thing, the third thing, I said two, but there's really three. I oftentimes do that. Number three is that the local domestic violence programs are overwhelmed. But I tell you, they would be more than happy to work with you to help you understand what kind of resistance they've seen in their state. And then you can better address it through those other two channels so that you know more specifically what domestic violence programs have been up against, quote unquote, as far as trying to deal with the domestic violence legislation. So those are the 3 things.
So I'm kind of in the middle of the grassroots efforts myself, because my bill has not gone hasn't finished. The final step is having the governor of the state of New Jersey finally sign my piece of legislation. So what I am encouraging the advocates in my state and those that are willing to help is basically call the governor's office, do letters to our media in the state, write to our major newspapers, let them know why this piece of legislation in New Jersey is very important, and to encourage the governor to sign it, and to sign it as soon as possible. So as long as we keep it, as it was mentioned before, to keep it in the forefront, to let people know that domestic violence is an epidemic in this country, and it's a silent killer of women. And we have to let people know that we have the power to do something about it. And it is, a federal legislation such as this is something so common sense that we can do. We have the power to do this. We have the power to change the way our society acts towards women. And we should do this. Everybody should, stand behind this piece of legislation on the federal level, and have Congress pass it and give it to the governor so he can, give it to the president so he can sign it into law and make it the law of our country. So it's about, like was mentioned before, the power of the people. We are Americans, and we are capable of everything, and we can do everything as long as we set our minds to it. So I as a state representative, I challenge all of you to get involved and make sure that this piece of legislation on the federal level gets to Congress, gets to every member of Congress and let them see why it's important, and it has to get to the desk of the president so he can sign it. So this is important. This is about saving lives of women. This is about saving our sisters, our mothers, our aunts, our friends. We need to save them because they are important.
And I would just add that, I think, putting a human face on it is very, very important. But when you really think about it, you think about the numbers of domestic violence. Nearly 8 million days of paid work are lost annually due to domestic violence. That's equivalent of about 32,000 full-time jobs each year. And at a presentation I attended a few weeks ago at the U.S. Department of State, U.S. Ambassador at Large Catherine Russell, she said that some research has been done which shows that domestic violence costs economies about 2% of the gross domestic product. That's about the same amount that most economies spend on education. And then more than 6 million children witness domestic violence annually. So this is not just about domestic violence. This isn't just about the women whose lives are tortured, but it's about the children and the future of this world. So I think from a framing perspective, we've got to really talk about how devastating this is all around, and the fact that this is not unique to specific communities. This impacts everyone. So I think the more we can keep it away from the gun issue and focus more on domestic violence, and also the fact that it's just not okay for women to be controlled. It's just not. And so from a preventive standpoint, that's why we at the YWCA really want to focus on stopping it before it ever starts. Talking to children from a very early age and letting them know it's just not okay. And both women and men, and I would have loved, I applaud the men who were here today, but I think we need to bring more men into the discussion because, honestly, most of the perpetrators of domestic violence are men, and we need to figure out a way to change that.
Okay, so it turns out we do have one more question in the back. Typically, this would fall under the Judiciary Committee, and that is Chairman Bob Goodlatte, I believe, but I haven't seen any statements at this point in time. The bill was just introduced today as well, so I don't think there's been an opportunity to respond. And I think it'll come down to, of course, the members and then they're going to probably proceed to get co-sponsors, and then it would be up to that chairman of the committee to bring it up there first, as Congressman Dold was saying. Typically, they would mark it up there, debate it, vote on it out of committee, and then it would be up to the speaker, to the GOP leadership in the House to bring it to the floor. But I think that would go back to the grassroots idea of this, where, as they were saying, this is the kind of bill that would also require constituents to be writing into their members of Congress and urging them to be more active on this front. But yeah, to answer your question. And thank you. So I guess that, this concludes, I think, our panel, and I want to take this opportunity to thank all of our wonderful guests here for taking out the time, sharing their personal stories, and really addressing the importance of this intersection that I think doesn't get a lot of attention, but clearly has a very real impact on the daily lives of women and families across the country. And thank you to Americans for Responsible Solutions as well for hosting, and thank you for coming.